So Gwen always says her favorite question for her patients is, where does your story start? And I'm going to try and apply that to the story of this book, which came about because Gwen and I, who are very old friends, were talking about the fact that she was coming to the end or near the end of a long career in forensic psychiatry, mostly working at Broadmoor. And she wanted to put down on paper her thoughts about evil and the nature of human cruelty. So initially she had thought that she might write something in an essay form, a short book about evil, she was going to call it, which sounded brilliant to me because I think, like everyone, I'm just fascinated by the human condition and how the mind works, and especially criminal minds. How do those monstrous people do what they do, and why? And can they ever be changed? But as we got to talking about it, and after I offered to help her to write something that might appeal to a broader audience beyond the professional or the academic, we decided to apply the same principle that you might be familiar with from therapy, which is that if you can tell your story, you can gain greater understanding. So if we could tell a series of stories rather than essays about people's lives and how they changed when they worked with Gwen in therapy, this might be more illuminating for the public. You know, I think we do approach the material differently in the sense that I'm a dramatist and she's a doctor. So, for example, I was always trying to find the narrative line and follow the story arc. And she would very gently and very kindly say, you know, this is real life. It doesn't have a neat ending. and that's okay. And actually, some of my favorite short story writers do not have neat endings or tidy resolutions either. So I was reminded of that while we were working together and heartened by that. We certainly have differences in language. And what I tried to do was always reflect Gwen's words. So, for example, I would interview her and shape the structure of the story and work out the composite of, say, 2 or 3 people who'd committed the same offense to create one of our stories. And then I would run it by her and she would feed back, and it was a back and forth, often 10 or 15 times before we got to a draft. And in that process, well, first of all, there was a lot of her correcting my Americanisms and saying, I remember once writing something like, he thought there was an off-ramp to freedom. And she said, an off-ramp? What is that? So there were certainly, you know, 2 countries divided by the same language moments. But also she has a certain poetry to the way that she speaks, which is so beautiful. And really, it was my job, like someone with a net capturing beautiful butterflies, to try and be sure and retain that and reflect that in every page. Very early on, when I told friends and family what I was working on with Gwen, they expressed a kind of deep concern for me. Was I okay? What was it like thinking about that stuff all day and talking to somebody about violent crimes all the time? Was I all right? And periodically, you know, people would ring me and say, how are you doing? Or would you like to go see a funny movie? Or would you like to read a comic book or something to relieve the tension? I have to be honest, I didn't find it that difficult, partly because Gwen is so humane, so compassionate, and so loving in the way that she talks about the work that she does, and I learned so much. I never felt afraid or even really shocked. She isn't sensational when she describes what people have done. She's very matter-of-fact about the medical and legal elements of each case when I'm interviewing her. So I didn't feel afraid or shocked. And I guess that's the blessing of working with Gwen, who is also not shocked or fearful around her work. And I guess I got some of that by osmosis. Well, Gwen and I selected the stories that we included. The publishers were not guiding us towards any particular stories. It very much came from us. I think that it became really obvious that there were certain stories that we had to tell, that we must include, either because they were extreme cases or dealing with phenomena or mental conditions that people are very curious about and that are part of the public conversation. We were also guided to include things by the timeline itself. Over 30 years, Gwen went on a learning curve, and so we wanted to be able to describe that through different stories where she made mistakes, where she applied something she'd learned when she was younger to a case that was in the more recent past, and so on. We also obviously wanted to make the stories representative of the different races, genders, cultural experiences, social backgrounds, and so on, and not be too samey. And so that was definitely a part of our consideration. But to come to the question, there was one story that we felt we couldn't include in the end. I will say it was partly because the book was getting to be so long and we didn't want it to be a doorstop. And that was an extraordinary story about a transgender patient that Gwen worked with. And we just felt, as we were working on it, that it was very difficult in the space that we had and with the story that we had to communicate her understanding of that story in this moment. I hope that we will get to come back to that in future. I think there was also a point where we'd, absolutely chosen the stories we wanted. And I suddenly rang Gwen one day and said, hey, there are no stories in here about rapists. I'm looking at all the crimes and we've got serial killing, we've got stalking, we've got arson, but we don't have any rapists. And she said, well, the truth is that I don't really work with rapists, certainly not in a high secure hospital. They don't tend to go there. They go to prison. And later she told me also that she preferred not to work with rapists if she had to express a preference, but I'll let her speak to that. So I hope readers of this book will take away from it what I did by working on it, by having the privilege of working with Gwen to create these stories, which is a new understanding of the human condition and this idea that we are all more alike than we are different. I hope that these stories illuminate for you the similarities rather than the differences between us and the people that we write about. That's certainly the gift that working with Gwen has given me, and it's made me look at the world in a new way. Towards the end of the first draft of the book, I watched a documentary reconstruction, sort of true crime series on HBO about a serial killer. And I really had this eerie sensation about halfway through that I was just waiting to discover what kind of early childhood adversity he'd experienced, rather than waiting to see how many years the judge was going to give him in prison or what was going to happen. I looked at the entire story with a new pair of glasses. It was really a revelation, and I've had that happen again and again in subsequent months. So I hope that happens for readers, because what more can we ask from any book than that it teaches us a new way to look at the world? Wow.